Nearly 40% of America's vegetables and two-thirds of its fruits and nuts come from just one place, California. But what happens when the water runs out and Canada says no to helping? While the U.S. has been focused on trade wars and tariffs, a much bigger crisis has been quietly boiling beneath the surface. Donald Trump just made a demand that shocked the world. He wants access to Canada's fresh water, calling it the key to America's survival. But Canada didn't just refuse. They shut the door hard. Now farms are failing, factories are slowing down, and prices are spiking across the country. Behind closed doors, Washington is scrambling, while the world watches a new kind of power struggle unfold, not over oil or money, but over water. So how did we get here? And just how far could this go? The truth might shake more than just U.S.-Canada relations. It could change everything. Number 1. Ports collapse, the first sign of trouble. Before the water crisis took center stage, another disaster was quietly unfolding at America's ports. It started with tariffs, new taxes slapped on imported goods as part of President Trump's escalating trade war. At first, the focus was on steel, lumber, and automobiles. But the ripple effects reached much further. Within months, container bookings at major U.S. ports dropped by nearly 50%, an alarming signal that global supply chains were faltering. The Port of Los Angeles, the busiest in the Western Hemisphere, braced for one of its sharpest slowdowns in decades. Cargo volumes plummeted, ships were delayed, warehouses sat half-empty. Meanwhile, as American ports struggled, Canada saw a sudden spike in interest, especially at the Port of Churchill. Tucked away in northern Manitoba, Churchill had long been overlooked due to its remote location and harsh climate. But now it was positioned to become a strategic lifeline. With trade routes shifting and tariffs choking U.S. access to global markets, Canada's Arctic gateway offered something new, a direct path to European and Asian buyers, faster and cheaper. Suddenly, what had once been a forgotten shipping hub became a hot topic in boardrooms and government meetings. Canadian exporters began rerouting goods through Churchill, sidestepping the U.S. entirely. Wheat, minerals, and fuel started flowing out of Canada's north, reaching global markets in record time. It was a quiet but powerful move. Canada was proving it could stand on its own without relying on American infrastructure. But this wasn't just about trade. This was the first domino to fall. As the U.S. watched its ports stall and its influence over trade routes weaken, a deeper fear began to set in. What other resources might Canada withhold if tensions grew worse? If they could reroute shipping, what else could they cut off? Behind the scenes, American strategists began assessing risks they'd never seriously considered before. Energy, timber, fresh water, and that last one, water, was about to become the most explosive issue of all. Because while the ports were collapsing above the surface, beneath it, a new kind of war was already brewing, not with tanks or tariffs, but with pipelines, rivers, and reservoirs. The trade war was just the beginning. What came next would test alliances, shake economies, and expose the one thing even the world's most powerful nation couldn't live without. Number 2, the unexpected front, water. While most eyes were still locked on tariffs and trade routes, a new and completely unexpected battlefront began to emerge. Not over steel, not over oil, but over water. It started subtly, with a few offhand remarks from President Trump about drought-stricken states and the need for new sources of fresh water. But it didn't take long before those comments turned into a direct demand aimed squarely at Canada. In a bold and controversial speech, Trump declared that Canada's rivers and lakes were the key to America's survival, a vast, untapped resource that could rescue states like California, Arizona, and Nevada from the grip of long-running drought. At the center of his focus was the Columbia River, a sprawling water system that winds over 2,000 kilometers through the Pacific Northwest, crossing from British Columbia into U.S. territory. For decades, this river had been managed under the Columbia River Treaty of 1961, a landmark agreement that balanced flood control and hydroelectric power between the two nations. But with a single declaration, Trump shattered that balance. He called for full access to Canadian water, not as a request, but as a necessity. The message was loud and clear. America was done waiting. It would now treat Canadian water as a strategic asset, something to be tapped, diverted, and consumed in the name of national survival. What had once been a model of peaceful cooperation suddenly became a political weapon. In Ottawa, the reaction was swift and defiant. Environmental groups, indigenous communities, and national advocacy organizations came together in opposition. More than 80 coalitions spoke out, framing Trump's demand not as a policy issue, but as a threat to Canadian sovereignty. And leading the charge was Prime Minister Mark Carney, a former banker turned unlikely political firebrand, who stood before the nation and said 6 words that made headlines around the world: Canada is not for sale, period. With that one statement, the entire conversation changed. Water was no longer just a resource, it was a line in the sand, and the U.S. had just crossed it. From that moment on, the trade war evolved into something much more volatile. This was no longer about shipments and tariffs. It was about survival, power, and control over the most essential resource on Earth. And the consequences of Canada's refusal were about to hit the U.S. economy like a tidal wave. Number 3, Canada's refusal. Mark Carney's defining moment. For most of his career, Mark Carney was known as the calm voice in the room, the banker's banker. A man who managed financial crises with quiet precision, not bold speeches. But everything changed the day President Trump demanded access to Canada's water. Suddenly, Carney wasn't just a leader, he was the guardian of Canada's sovereignty, thrust into a high-stakes confrontation he never asked for. And in that moment, he delivered the most powerful line of his political career: Canada is not for sale, period. That refusal wasn't just symbolic. It marked a turning point in North American relations. Trump had assumed that in a time of crisis, when American farms were failing and cities were desperate, Canada would bend. Instead, Carney stood firm, signaling to the world that freshwater was off the table, not negotiable, not a commodity, not for anyone. His stand ignited a wave of support across the country. Indigenous leaders, long defenders of Canada's rivers and natural lands, rallied behind him. Environmentalists issued statements praising the decision as a bold act of resistance against exploitation. Even political rivals admitted this was the right call. In total, over 80 advocacy coalitions united in one message: giving up control of Canada's water would be a betrayal of everything the nation stood for. But Carney's declaration came with consequences. Within hours, what was once a routine treaty negotiation over the Columbia River turned into a geopolitical standoff. U.S. officials were blindsided. Trump had gambled that pressure and urgency would force Canada's hand. Instead, he triggered a backlash that would expose America's deepest resource vulnerability. Across the border, frustration turned to panic. U.S. states that had already made plans based on assumed Canadian water access, California, Arizona, Nevada, were now facing the reality that no help was coming. Infrastructure projects were halted, budgets were slashed, governors issued emergency warnings. What had once been quiet background planning became front-page news. And while American headlines questioned how things spiraled out of control, in Canada, a new kind of pride began to rise. For the first time in decades, Canadians watched their Prime Minister push back, not with force, but with conviction. Carney didn't just say no. He drew a hard line that signaled a new era in Canadian leadership, a moment that redefined him from financial technician to national defender. That single refusal was more than a headline. It was a message to the world. Canada's water is sacred, and no one, no matter how powerful, gets to claim it. Number 4, American fallout. From farmlands to factories, when Canada said no, the consequences hit the United States fast and hard. For months, Western states had been quietly counting on Canadian water to rescue them from an escalating crisis. California, Arizona, and Nevada were already facing record-breaking droughts, and Washington had floated promises that help was on the way. Water from Canadian rivers would be diverted south, saving crops, feeding cities, and restoring critical supply chains. But that lifeline was cut off overnight. In California's Central Valley, the agricultural heart of America, the impact was immediate. This region produces nearly 40% of the country's vegetables and over two-thirds of its fruits and nuts. Farmers had been preparing for incoming water deliveries, designing irrigation plans, hiring workers, buying fertilizer, but the water never came. Canals remained dry, allocations were slashed, entire harvests were lost before they even began. The economic shock rippled across the nation. Grocery prices soared. Tomatoes, lettuce, almonds, and dozens of other staples became scarce. For families already struggling with inflation, the grocery store became a weekly reminder of a crisis that most had no idea was even happening. Meanwhile, economists warned that the food shortages weren't just a domestic issue. They were about to disrupt global supply chains, especially in countries that rely heavily on U.S. agricultural exports. But the damage didn't stop at farms. Industries that depend on massive water consumption were next to feel the pain. In Arizona, massive semiconductor manufacturing plants, critical to America's tech sector, saw their operations stall. These facilities consumed tens of millions of gallons of water each week, and many had planned future expansions based on the expectation of a secure water supply. When that plan collapsed, so did production schedules. Energy plants, steel mills, automobile factories, and electronics manufacturers all took hits. Some cut shifts, others shut down entirely. In Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin, states where Trump had once promised a blue-collar resurgence, assembly lines paused and layoffs began. It became clear water wasn't just about farming, it was about keeping the country running. And for many Americans, this was the moment they realized something unsettling. The U.S., the world's largest economy, had allowed itself to become dependent on a foreign nation for survival. One decision in Ottawa had exposed a critical weakness. Canada had the water, America had the thirst, and now there was no backup plan. Number 5. Industrial breakdown and energy reversal. As the agricultural crisis deepened, a second wave of disruption began to spread, this time through the industrial backbone of the United States. America's factories, tech hubs, and energy producers were built on the assumption that water, like power or fuel, would always be available. But when Canada slammed the door shut, that illusion disappeared, and what followed was a system-wide breakdown unlike anything the country had seen in decades. In Arizona, massive semiconductor plants, some backed by billions in federal funding, relied on a constant flow of clean water to keep production running. Chips used in everything from smartphones to military equipment were now at risk. With no alternative supply, output slowed, delays stacked up, contracts were missed, and executives who had once championed domestic manufacturing began quietly warning that without water, America's tech ambitions could collapse. The same story played out across other water-intensive industries. In the Midwest and Pacific Northwest, energy producers who had banked on Canadian reserves were forced to turn back to coal and natural gas. Hydroelectric plants, already strained by low reservoir levels, couldn't meet demand. Utilities scrambled to keep the grid stable, and in doing so, reversed years of clean energy progress. Carbon emissions rose, electricity bills spiked, and consumers, already battling rising food prices, now faced higher energy costs too. Steel mills, automobile factories, and chemical plants weren't spared either. In states like Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin, where Trump had promised to bring industrial jobs back, the exact opposite was happening. Assembly lines halted, shifts were cut, and unions demanded answers. Water wasn't just a side issue. It had become the unseen lifeline of American manufacturing. And without it, production couldn't continue. Even the defense sector was hit. Facilities that built parts for military vehicles and aircraft were forced to delay shipments. For a government already stretched thin by international tensions, this added yet another layer of vulnerability. Water had exposed a truth no one wanted to admit. American industry had taken its most critical resource for granted. What was once seen as abundant and cheap was now scarce and strategic. And Canada's refusal didn't just create a bottleneck, it forced the U.S. to confront an uncomfortable reality. In a world shaped by drought, control over water means control over power. And right now, that control no longer belonged to Washington. Number 6, global implications. Canada's new role. As the crisis spiraled across the United States, the rest of the world began to take notice. And fast. What started as a U.S.-Canada dispute had suddenly transformed into a global wake-up call. Water, once seen as a local or regional issue, was now firmly on the geopolitical stage. And in the middle of it all stood Canada, no longer just a quiet neighbor to the north, but a rising global power in the age of resource scarcity. The refusal to hand over fresh water marked a defining moment. For decades, the Columbia River Treaty, signed in 1961, had been praised as a model of international cooperation. It balanced American flood control with Canadian hydroelectric profits and rarely made headlines. But when President Trump halted its renewal and demanded expanded access, everything changed. Canada's firm response signaled a global shift. Agreements once thought permanent could now unravel under political pressure. In European capitals, the implications were clear. If the U.S. couldn't rely on long-standing water agreements, what hope did other nations have in times of crisis? Investors and policymakers began to rethink their assumptions. Water security, once buried deep in economic forecasts, moved to the top of risk assessments. Sectors like agriculture, manufacturing, and tech were now seen as vulnerable to disruptions hundreds of miles away, depending on the political mood of a foreign government. Cities like Chicago, Detroit, and Cleveland, which rely on the Great Lakes for drinking water, were shaken by Trump's suggestion that even long-standing freshwater protections could be put on the negotiating table. The mere threat of destabilizing those agreements sent shockwaves through financial markets. Billions of dollars tied to infrastructure, shipping, and logistics were now at risk, because if water could be politicized, nothing was truly secure. And as the U.S. fumbled to contain the fallout, Canada's profile quietly surged. Global leaders began reaching out, not just for trade, but for partnerships in long-term water access. Countries facing their own droughts saw Canada not as a supplier, but as a gatekeeper to survival. With vast reserves of clean, fresh water and a government willing to stand firm against the world's most powerful nation, Canada had entered a new era. No longer a silent partner, it had become a central player in a resource war that had only just begun. And from that moment on, the world would watch Canada, not just for what it had, but for what it was willing to protect. Number 7, China and Europe enter the scene. As the United States scrambled to deal with water shortages and industrial slowdowns, two global giants saw a rare opening, and they moved quickly. China and Europe, both facing their own mounting water crises, began quietly shifting their attention toward Canada, a country that had suddenly become one of the world's most strategic players. The battle over water wasn't just a North American issue anymore, it had gone global. In Beijing, officials were already well-versed in the politics of resource acquisition. For decades, China had secured oil, minerals, and farmland across Africa, Latin America, and Central Asia. Now their focus had turned north. Chinese companies began quietly approaching Canadian firms with offers of long-term investment in exchange for future access to fresh water. These weren't public deals, but insiders revealed a growing push from China to position itself as a future stakeholder in Canada's water infrastructure, from reservoirs to transport systems. For China, water isn't just a commodity, it's the foundation of survival. Massive cities, sprawling tech zones, and entire regions of farmland depend on reliable access, and those sources are drying up. With the United States blocked out of Canada's supply, Beijing saw a chance to build a diplomatic and economic bridge where Washington had just burned one. Meanwhile, in Europe, Policymakers were quietly panicking. Years of record-breaking heat waves and relentless droughts had left parts of southern Europe, including Spain, Italy, and Greece, facing agricultural collapse. Brussels began revising its long-term climate strategy, and for the first time, Canadian water was being considered a part of the solution, not just in theory, but in actual trade talks and survival planning. What once seemed like science fiction, a global race for fresh water, was now unfolding in real time. Canada was being eyed not just as a friendly trading partner, but as a strategic lifeline. European nations began pushing for alliances, offering investment and cooperation in return for access, infrastructure partnerships, or future guarantees. For Ottawa, this sudden attention brought both opportunity and danger. On one hand, Canada had never been more globally relevant. On the other, it now had to navigate the ambitions of the world's biggest powers, each with its own agenda and appetite. Trump's failed demand had unintentionally done more than just start a dispute. It had signaled to China and Europe that the age of water diplomacy had begun, and that the real power no longer rested in oil fields or trade pacts, but in the lakes, rivers, and glaciers of Canada's untapped north. Number 8. History repeats. From oil to water. In the 1970s, the world was blindsided when a group of oil-rich nations decided to turn their resource into a weapon. The OPEC oil embargo didn't just raise prices, it shattered global economies, redrew alliances, and proved that control over a single resource could shift the balance of power overnight. Today, the world is watching as history begins to repeat itself, but this time, the battle isn't over oil, it's over water. What once seemed abundant and eternal is now the most strategic and scarce resource on the planet. And for the first time, a nation like Canada, long viewed as a quiet player in global affairs, is being seen as a potential kingmaker in a new world order. Prime Minister Mark Carney's refusal to sell or share Canada's fresh water wasn't just a defense of national sovereignty. It was a declaration that Canada holds something the world is rapidly running out of. And just like oil in the 70s, water is no longer just about survival. It's about leverage. From California's failing crops to factory slowdowns in the Midwest, the U.S. was forced to confront a harsh reality. Its power meant nothing without water. Washington had underestimated its northern neighbor, assuming that Canadian cooperation was a given. But when the moment came, Canada stood firm, and in doing so exposed the fragility of even the most powerful economy. Across the globe, governments are now reevaluating everything, from how they trade, to where they invest, to who they trust. Water is becoming a central calculation in foreign policy, just as oil once was. Trade deals are being restructured with water access in mind. Military strategists are planning for a future where water routes and supplies are as hotly contested as energy pipelines. And in the middle of it all, Canada has become a gatekeeper, not by force, but by geography, restraint, and political will. The country that was once seen as polite and passive now finds itself shaping global decisions. From Asia to Europe, leaders are taking note. Canada's water isn't just a national resource, it's a global game changer. The age of oil defined the 20th century, but the 21st is shaping up to be defined by who controls the water. And after this unprecedented standoff, one thing is crystal clear. Canada is no longer just part of the world stage, it's helping write the script. The battle over water has only just begun, and Canada's bold stand has shifted the global balance in ways no one saw coming. What was once considered a quiet natural resource is now a powerful tool of diplomacy, survival, and control. As droughts worsen and demand rises, the question isn't if water will become the next oil, it's when. So what happens when the world's thirst meets political resistance, and who controls the tap? If you found this eye-opening, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We've only scratched the surface of the world's next great power struggle.